All right, well, good morning and welcome to Adult Education here at Valley. This is the first of our spring edition, and it does not feel like spring at all. We have 4 inches of fresh snow here, and we had one brave soul who made his way across town or a few blocks maybe away. So Ted, thank you for coming this morning. We also have Melissa Carter and Jim Cooner here from Oak Grove Presbyterian Church. They made their way across town from Bloomington, so we're very thankful for them to be here to talk with us today about restorative actions. This is something that Oak Grove has embarked on in the last year or so, and they're here to share a little bit more about this opportunity that others around the PCUSA are being invited to join in. So I will let Jim introduce himself and say a little bit more about all that, and thank you for being here this morning.
Sheila, thank you, and thanks to the congregation for this opportunity to speak with you. Just to give you a little bit more history on where this began. We've been having conversations across a number of areas of the Presbyterian Church about reparation, about what can we do in direct answer to systemic racism or the benefits that we've received from systemic racism. In 2019, the end of 2019, we had a discussion, and I work at the Synod of Lakes and Prairies, and I had opportunity to talk with J. Herbert Nelson, who's the state clerk for the denomination, about the need to start to talk with churches and mid-council organizations about what they can do to speak out and speak out credibly against systemic racism, but also in favor of the issue of reparation. So this program that we're going to talk about today is not reparation. It is a social equity program that we seek to be a witness for the need for reparation, because the more we learn, the more we recognize the right thing that we need to do. So restorative action, we can take a look at the deck here, and I'm just going to kind of glance over at it. Restorative action is a means of surrendering wealth for community well-being. As we begin to understand more and more, we recognize how much white families, predominantly white families, predominantly white churches and organizations have benefited from the systems that are out there today, and recognize that something needs to be done, and something needs to be provided as a way of shedding ill-gotten gains, that wealth that we wouldn't otherwise have but for these systems. Change the slide. This shows the working group. We've been in conversation since early 2000 with this group meeting weekly or monthly. It includes Ilona Street Stewart and Reverend Gregory Bentley, the co-moderators of the Presbyterian Church, as well as Anthony Germain Allen, who did some pastoral work in the Twin Cities. He is now at Union Seminary in New York as a PhD candidate, and he is studying this topic and has done a lot of guidance to us on this. There are others on the work team. Again, we've been meeting weekly or monthly. You can go up before. So restorative actions is grounded in theology, justice, and economics. It is we spent a lot of time working through what are the theological groundings, underpinnings of this justice work and what we need to do. And in a nutshell, we're taught that that justice is to recognize what is wrong and to act accordingly to make it right. We can go to the next slide. The approach here is to help organizations and individuals look at the assets that they have and recognize what portion of those assets are held by them as a result of the systemic advantages that our system in America has provided them. To more than look at that, but to also understand what would be our proportionate share of wealth that is due to those sources, and provide a mechanism for us to surrender that wealth, surrender it for benefit of the communities that have been harmed here, AfroAmerican communities and Indigenous communities for the most part. We'll go into the numbers in just a moment. And as more and more of us have discussion about racial injustices, more and more we're left with the feeling, what can we do? How does it relate to me? And what can I do? And this is what we're seeking to provide. Go ahead. So what it is based on? It is based on national figures that look at the degree of wealth that is accumulated for white households relative to Afro-American and Indigenous households. Go to the next slide and show it in a pictorial. You can see that these numbers are as of 2019. The average wealth of households, white households in America, is $992,000. That's the average. And we all know the averages are affected largely by the top. But that $992,000, if we were to do the same look, you'll see largely the same shape of this graph if you look at the median, or if you look at a quartile basis, you would see very similar shape of this high wealth among the white households, significantly lower for Afro-American and Indigenous households. Let's go to the next one. And it's been growing. I'd call your attention to the top line in this chart and the bottom two lines. The top line is how wealth has grown across white households in America from 1963, I believe, up to 2019. And you can see that, and you can compare that to the wealth growth of Afro-American and Indigenous households with the two lines. The line between them is what the average would be. So there are 85 million white households. So they're driving this average. The average comes in at in 2019 at about $830,000 would be the average if everything were at parity. Let's go to the next slide. So this comes back to that 992 graph that we saw before, but it breaks it into what is among these household wealth figures, how much is above the average or parity, what would be fair and equitable, and how much is below. And you can see that $162,000 on average for white households is above the parity line. So if not for these things that have skewed wealth our way, if not for those, and a lot of this goes back to slavery and those things that the country was built upon, but a lot of it, as you saw the growth take off, has happened really since the 1980s. That $162,000 compared to the overall wealth of those white households, 992, is 16%. 16% on average, the wealth of a white American household is due to these favors that they've received. This shows how we've got to that. Well, actually, this first takes that $162,000 difference today and multiplies it by the population of white households in America, to get a number that shows the wealth gap, which is what in total is that amount in aggregate across all those households of that difference, that amount of parity. And it comes up to almost $14 trillion by 2019. What you can see here also is the stark climb from the 80s on. You can, as you look at, we won't do this today, but as you look at the policies of that day and the policies that remain today, you can see why this has happened. Now, if we went back to 1963, the very first small bar, the wealth gap at that point, and these are in 2020 dollars, so it's all inflation adjusted, would be just less than $1 trillion. Wealth tends to beget wealth. If you have those who have wealth can reinvest it. So some of this growth is natural. You would expect it to compound essentially. But if we were to go back to the 0.7 trillion, and if we were to say that it was only that had occurred prior to 1963, slavery, Jim Crow, wrestling land from the Indigenous, it would go from 0.7. This line would. I'm trying to do it on the screen, but I can't. The line would. You could draw that line through the 2019. It would be about 4.5 trillion. $10 trillion has happened in our working lifetimes. Next slide. So economic justice. So this picture is a depiction of the white wealth. If 16% of the white wealth were redistributed, and I don't know how that looks to happen, but somehow it needs to, it would bring all these groups. It would be enough to bring all these groups at parity. If every white household and every predominantly white organization were to identify 16% of their wealth and transfer it somehow, we would be at parity. That's not going to happen. It's back to reparation. Reparation is a national issue. It's a national kind of number. 14 trillion is a national number. We want to do our proportionate share, or allow churches to do their proportionate share as witness to the fact that we want to do this. It would be right to do this. Melissa Carter is going to talk a bit more about how this all works. Thank you.
Now it is. Yes, okay. We can go to the next slide. So how could this work? You've heard the facts around why, or the fact that there is a significant racial wealth gap, and that racial wealth gap is impacting people. Restorative Actions seeks to allow some redistribution. It seeks to allow white individuals to surrender their ill-gotten wealth in order for AfroAmerican and Indigenous communities to flourish. And the way that is to happen is to create trusts. We are creating 2 AfroAmerican trusts and 2 Indigenous trusts, a private charitable trust and a regular private trust for each of those communities. And the reason why we have a charitable trust and a regular private trust is because not all community organizations or individuals are registered 501c3s. And the IRS is very particular on that, and hence we need 2 trusts per. And also that each of the trustees will be representatives from those individual communities. The key thing about surrendering is a 2-part effort. It is surrendering the ill-gotten wealth, also surrendering control over what happens with that money. This is not charity. It is not a gift where we as white people should have the authority to deem an organization worthy of our gift. It is surrendering money that shouldn't have been ours to begin with, and therefore surrendering the control as well. Now, in addition to the words of using surrender and how important that is to what we are trying to accomplish, so are the terms Indigenous and AfroAmerican when we identify the communities in which we'll be beneficiaries of these trusts. So we're going to talk about that real briefly. We can move on to Indigenous. So what is in a name for Indigenous? And you can see all of the detail on this slide. And in summary, Indigenous, it is a term that currently encompasses as all individuals who are native to this land that is now known as the United States. There are many terms that are used in our society today, but unfortunately they do not encompass that. American Indian, Native American, primarily our continental 48 states. But we also have Alaskan Natives, Hawaiian Natives. In addition, the government does not actually recognize all indigenous tribes in the United States. And so it was very important to come to a term that would be very inclusive to all of the individuals who are native to these lands. We're going to move to AfroAmerican now. Afro-American is slightly different, where Indigenous was a very broad term because of the systemic issues that impact that community of people. Afro-American is a very specific term, and it is not a new term. I think for a number of people in our generation, they feel as though that is a very new term or something that has to do with hairstyle, and that's not the case. It is a term that akins back to the late 1800s and was specifically called out by individuals, Afro-American men and women, who at that time wanted to identify themselves as individuals, descendants of Africans who were brought over in enslavement and chose to stay. That they were not going to be relegated to some Western African country, which they had no relationship to, outside of the fact that they were part of that given continent. But they were born here in the United States, and they were choosing to stay and prosper here. And so these trusts are focused on supporting those Afro-Americans whom are descendants of enslaved individuals, okay? So not a huge broad scope of all Black people in the United States, descendants of Afro-Americans. We can move on to the next slide. So now back to the structure of the trust. That is why the name of the trusts are so important. And again, 2 trusts for Indigenous, 2 trusts for Afro-Americans, and those trusts being led by individuals from the respective communities. And so surrendering the money and surrendering the control. We can move on to the next one. As Jim mentioned, this initiative has been discussed, chatted about, talked through for a number of years now. And one of the key things that was put to our group a couple of years ago was, sure, sounds like a great idea to have an economic justice initiative, but until we have organizations and individuals who are willing to surrender their ill-gotten gains, we don't know that this is a great initiative because it requires that first part. And so that is what we did. And so the Synod of Lakes and Prairies, Oak Grove Presbyterian Church, and then we have a few individuals who have committed to surrender their ill-gotten gains. That adds up to just over $900,000. And so it put us in a position where we said, yes, we do believe that this is something that people are interested in doing, and then continue to move forward with the legal structures of the trusts. We can move on. So we are going to, in this room, play a preview of a curriculum that has been created. It did change the name. It's called The Time for Repair. When we first started, it was A Time for Repair. When you have an opportunity, if you can go to YouTube and go to Restorative Actions, it has an olive branch as our logo, and click and watch this curriculum preview, please. And also a content warning, there are very harsh and troublesome images, so just prepare yourself as you do watch this. Welcome back. I hope that you took time to watch the video on the curriculum. That video is a direct response from a number of pastors who care for predominantly white congregations and asking the question, how do I talk to my congregation about reparations? How do I speak to them about justice when it comes to this? Because it is such a polarizing issue in our society right now. And this curriculum was created for that. It is a 5-week curriculum, and it is in the process of being piloted right now. We can move on to the next slide. So what's next? Right now we are in the process of finalizing the fund structure and distribution mechanisms, which are the legal trust structure. We are sharing widely across our PCUSA networks and ecumenical partners. Key thing to note is that while a number of us are part of PCUSA, the initiative is not of the PCUSA. It is a separate initiative, and we are engaging with congregations outside of the Presbyterian Church for this. Also, the distributions are not limited to those individuals who are Presbyterian or even Christian for that matter, right? As I mentioned, we're piloting the AfroAmerican curriculum that you just saw the preview for, and then we'll be starting the Indigenous curriculum as well, because the issues and the challenges that Indigenous people have faced are different. While the result in prevention of wealth accumulation is similar, the reasons for which that has happened are different, and so the discussions will need to be different. We are in the process of naming trustees for our Afro-American trusts. We're not as far along on the Indigenous trusts. And then hopefully soon we will be receiving applications for distributions of funds to have distributions sometime in this year, in 2022. So that is all we have in terms of prepared material, and we would open it up for additional questions. And thank you for those who are watching it.
All right. Well, thank you for being here. This is kind of a strange adult ed. It's not typical for us, but with the snow, this kind of thing happens. And so all of you who are watching the recording at home, what I'm going to invite you to do is to please write out your questions, send them to me. I will email me, sheila.sheldon@valleychurch.net. You all know how to get a hold of me. Send me your questions. I'm going to compile them all, and then I will send them off to Melissa and Jim. And if you are able to answer those questions, then we will get them back to you. My other hope is to invite Melissa and Jim to come back, maybe later this spring, summer, when we can have another conversation with more folks when the weather is a little bit nicer, because I think that this particular topic is so important. We have so many gifts here at Valley that we really need to consider how we receive those gifts and how we can give those gifts back out. So I really hope that we can continue this conversation, and it's an in-person kind of conversation. It's not really a virtual conversation. So hopefully we can plan that out and find a day where, the weather does not decide to intervene and spoil our plans.